Welcome back to Leia's Library. Find yourself a cozy corner, grab yourself a nice mug of tea, and let's get started. So, this video will be going over all of the books that I read in February of this year, which is 2022 if you're watching this in the future. And yes, it is 3 months late if you're watching this in the present. Sometimes life just happens. And sometimes life just happens a lot. Let's get started. So, the first book that I read in February was Blackwater Sister by Zen Cho. This is an urban fantasy about a Malaysian American woman in her 20s named Jessamine. Jessamine has just moved back to Malaysia with her parents, which is a country that she hasn't been to since she was a toddler. So when she starts hearing a voice in her head, she chalks it up to stress, but the voice claims to be the ghost of her deceased grandmother, who in life was a spirit medium and avatar for a mysterious deity known as the Blackwater Sister. Now, Jessamine's grandmother is determined to settle a score against a gang boss who has offended the god, and has decided that Jess is going to help her achieve this goal. I really enjoyed this book. I really liked Jess. She was a great character to follow. You really get the impression that she's just out here doing her best, and she really makes every decision based on what she thinks is the right decision, even though you as the reader are kind of going, But at the same time, I found myself sometimes going like, why? But at the same time, I completely understood why she was making these choices. So I wasn't actually upset, you know? There's this theme of duality throughout the book that was kind of sprinkled in everywhere, and it was done really well, I thought. Jess is constantly being pulled from two different sides. There's who she is and who she wants to be, and what her family expects of her, and who her family thinks she is. And this is constantly referenced in like a number of different ways. There's a lot of comparisons between her life in America versus her life in Malaysia, or her like Malaysian roots. And Jess herself is a queer woman who has a girlfriend back in the States, or America, but her family, she doesn't think her family would accept her, so she's not out to them. So they keep trying to set her up with men, which she has no interest in. Even her full name is Jessamine, and everyone from the States, so like her girlfriend mostly, calls her Jess, and Jess is how she introduces herself, but all of her family members call her Min. So I just thought that was really interesting. And there's this quote that sums up this duality really well, so I'm gonna read it to you. She wasn't Malaysian or American, just as she wasn't straight, but she definitely wasn't gay if anyone was asking. She wasn't her family's Min, but she wasn't the Jess who'd had a life under that name. Her beautiful life, with her beautiful girlfriend, her friends, her creative projects, her ambitions. No wonder her grandmother had found it so easy to get in her head. She was a walking nothing, a hole in the universe, perfect for letting the dead through. Speaks for itself. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I think you should check it out. It's a standalone, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's just one. Low commitment. So, next book that I read was the first one is These Violent Delights. Our Violent Ends by Chloe Gong, which is the sequel to These Violent Delights, which I read last year. It's a Romeo and Juliet retelling set in 1920s Shanghai. Our Romeo and Juliet, who are Roma Montagov and Juliet Tsai, respectively, are the heirs to 2 rival gangs currently controlling the city. One of them is the White Flowers, which is a Russian gang that Roma Montagov is the heir to, and the other one is a native Chinese gang or Shanghainese gang called the Scarlet Gang, which is who Juliet is the heir to. This series is very gritty, it's very violent. It follows a lot of very morally gray characters. Nobody in this series is necessarily a good person, but they're all, well, not all of them. Most of the main characters are kind of doing their best in the situation that they're given or the situation that they're in. It's also, I said it was violent, but I found it had a nice balance, so it wasn't gratuitously violent and it wasn't bluntly or shockingly violent. And the writing is so lovely that even when it's describing these very violent scenes, the writing is elevated enough so that it's not quite as visceral as it could have been, but it is still describing violence. So if that is uncomfortable for you, just be aware before picking it up. I just really like these characters. Juliet a little bit more so than Roma. I just find that she was a little bit more three-dimensional. We got to know her a bit better than we did Roma in both of the books, but I still enjoyed Roma. The ending of this book was exactly what I wanted it to be, and I won't spoil anything, but I will just say that I thought it was a perfect send-off for these two characters. Although speaking of the characters, in this particular book, I felt some of them were a little underutilized. And I know this book, before it was a duology, it was supposed to just be one very long book, so I don't know if this is a side effect of that. But some of the characters just didn't show up very much for how important they were to the plot, I thought. And if you've read this series, I'm talking about Kathleen and Rosalind. Kathleen especially, I think. I just wanted to see more Kathleen. I really like Kathleen. I did have the same problem with this book that I had in the first book, which is that there is a fantasy element to this series that I just think is unnecessary. I think, and I love fantasy, but I think this series would have worked a little bit better if it was more grounded in reality and it was just a historical fiction or a historical retelling. But what can you do? I do also want to note that there is some LGBTQ plus, what's it called? Representation. There is a character who is male to female trans, and there is some Achillean, MLM, gay, however you would like to refer to them as. I think all of them are equally appropriate characters. So, isn't that nice? Overall, I rated this book 4 out of 5. Much like the first one. If I'm being really picky, I probably would say I rated the first one 3 out of 5, maybe 3.5 out of 5. But I still enjoyed the series as a whole. So if it sounds like something that's up your alley, I would recommend it. I'm also going to be keeping my eye out for anything else that Chloe Gong writes, because I really enjoyed her writing. Next book I read was, I almost said Madeline by Circe Miller. It was Circe by Madeline. Whoa. It was Circe by Madeline Miller. Third time's the charm. This is a mythology retelling of Circe, who is the Titan from Greek mythology. Circe is the daughter of Helios, who is the Sun Titan, and he is a very, very powerful Titan. But unlike her other divine siblings, Circe doesn't seem to have any innate powers herself, until she discovers that she has the power of witchcraft, or the power to transform beings into other beings, which is something that threatens the gods themselves and makes them go, can't have that. So she gets outcast to a remote island all by herself, and we follow along her journey, or not just her journey, her whole life. We follow her whole life, basically, as she is cast out. And I read this book and thought, oh, this is what I wanted The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue to be. Because it is primarily a character study of Circe. There isn't even very much plot until like 3/4 of the way into the book, which isn't a bad thing at all, because like I said, it's more of a character study, so you want that time to just follow this character and see what they're up to. I think some people might find it a bit slow because of the lack of plot, but I would still encourage you to keep with it if you're not sure, or if you're currently reading it and you're having doubts. Just stick with it if you want. If you're hating it, then don't. I won't tell you what to do. I loved Circe, like the character. I loved watching her grow from this timid little reject into this powerful goddess who always fights for what she thinks is right, and who always desperately tries to protect her loved ones. And one thing I forgot to mention in my Song of Achilles review was that Madeline Miller is amazing at writing books that feel as if they are direct translations from an ancient Greek text. Like, she has captured the feeling of an ancient Greek myth perfectly, in my opinion. I've read at least one. I don't actually know if I've read a few. That's a lie. I've totally read a few. I read a few Greek myth, like direct translations, and Madeline Miller has this same sort of like structure and way of describing things that I've also found in those retellings or those translations, and I just thought that was really neat. Good on you, Madeline Miller, if you're watching this, which I know you're not. I think you did a great job. But on top of that reason for the writing being good, the writing just also really beautifully captures Circe's naivety and her fear, and reading it, everything was always tinged with like a little bit of melancholy. It's just very nice. I really enjoyed it. 4 out of 5 stars. Would recommend. Next, we have Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is another mythology retelling, but this time of Ariadne, Princess of Crete. She is known from the Theseus myth, or the Theseus and the Minotaur myth. Also, I've heard it pronounced Minotaur and Minotaur. I grew up saying Minotaur, but feel free to blast me for that in the comments if that's incorrect. So in this book, Ariadne grows up in the palace in Crete, but underneath the palace roams the Minotaur in his labyrinth. The Minotaur is a half-man, half-bull monster, and also Ariadne's half-brother. He runs a blood sacrifice every year. So every year, I think it's 10 Athenians are sacrificed to the monster. Until this year, among the sacrifices is Theseus, Prince of Athens, and he has come to slay the monster, and Ariadne sees a way out in him. I really wanted to love this book. I really did. I loved what it was trying to do. I just didn't think it quite pulled it off for me. There's a lot of mention in this book of how in a lot of these myths and these stories, it's the women who suffer the consequences for men's arrogance and men's mistakes. Like in the very beginning, she mentions Medusa, who was turned into a monster by Athena after Poseidon forced himself on her in Athena's temple, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not the original Medusa myth, right? Because the original Medusa myth, she was just a straight up monster. She was a Gorgon. Yeah. I feel like I heard that this, like, Medusa being turned into a monster is a more modern myth. And by modern, I still mean it might be hundreds of years old. But I don't think it's the original one. But I could be wrong. Anyway, she also brings up Heracles, who you might know as Hercules. But Heracles was hated by the goddess Hera, so she kind of struck him with madness, and in his madness he murdered his wife and child, I believe. He at least murdered his wife. So, she kind of shows you that it's always the women who suffer when men make mistakes, or, women suffer the consequences of men's actions. And even in her own story, Ariadne experiences this firsthand with her mother. So her mother is driven mad by the gods when her father insults them. I think he ends up claiming to be as good as them. I could be getting that wrong. But so the gods, to punish her father, put a madness spell on her mother, and in her madness, Ariadne's mother suddenly desires a sacred bowl, and she acts on those desires, and that's how we have the Minotaur. Yikes. And this breaks Ariadne's mother. She is never the same after this. After the madness wears off and she realizes what she's done, she is a changed person, as one would be. So Ariadne at the very beginning makes this vow to herself that she will never be taken advantage of like that. She will never suffer the consequences of a man's actions. And then she does. Which could have been really interesting. It could have been really effective if it had been done another way. This way just wasn't for me. The writing was what I had the most problems with. Everything was just very heavy-handed. Everything was laid out in an unnecessary amount of detail, I found. For example, Theseus has a 2-page long monologue full of information that we mostly already knew. And the same thing happens again with another character further in. And on top of that, there were just things that felt inconsistent. Both Ariadne and her little sister Phaedra, they have their own respective infatuations with different characters that come out of nowhere and are very intense, to the point where Ariadne is sobbing at the idea of just not being able to touch Theseus. So that was a lot. It was almost like they had a madness struck upon them, and the book kind of seems to imply that, but it never goes anywhere, and it never strongly implies it. It's just one of the characters says, I almost feel like a spell has come over me when I'm around this person, and it just wasn't for me. I'm sorry. I liked Phaedra a lot more than I liked Ariadne, personally. I thought she was much more interesting. But even she wasn't safe. Although I will say, despite all of this, I did feel compelled to finish it because I was invested in. I really wanted to know how it ended. So it wasn't a waste of time. I'm still glad I read it, but yeah, I won't be rereading it. It was 3 out of 5 stars for me. If you're interested in Greek retellings and you want to hear more about Ariadne, I'd say give it a try. But if you've never even heard of the myth of Theseus or Ariadne before today, you probably won't enjoy it. I'm sorry. Next up, I read The Princess Diarist by Carrie Fisher. This is a memoir about Carrie Fisher's experiences on set of the first Star Wars movie. Carrie Fisher, if you're not already aware, is the actress who portrayed Princess Leia. And outside of film, she was also a very big advocate for mental health and mental illness destigmatization, as she herself was bipolar. She was national treasure, and we are very unfortunate to have lost her so early. This book in particular focuses on two things. Her musings on the joy and insanity of celebrity life, and also her on-set affair with Harrison Ford, who was her co-star and who played Han Solo. True to Carrie Fisher nature, this book is very open, it's very honest about her experiences and her thoughts and feelings from that time. From the time she started acting to getting the role of Leia, and how Leia shaped her whole entire life moving forward. It's also hilarious. Carrie Fisher was incredibly witty. She was very smart, and I genuinely laughed out loud several times. The reason I picked this book up, on top of being a huge Carrie Fisher fan, was that I heard that she talks about her thoughts on the infamous gold bikini, which I was really interested in because I am currently working on a different project for a different channel about that costume. So I was really looking forward to hearing her thoughts, but she doesn't really talk about it. So somebody lied to me on the internet. Can you imagine that? She does mention it a little bit, but it's not in any sort of detail. So if that's why you're picking this up, don't be duped like I was. Still read it though, if you want. I encourage you to read it if you want. If you want. Anyway, very glad to have read it. 4 stars. The next book I read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a fiction about an aging Hollywood bombshell actress named Evelyn Hugo, who decides she is ready to write a tell-all memoir, including the details of the 7 different marriages that she had, which she is infamous for. She chooses an unknown reporter named Monique Grant as her autobiographer, for reasons known only to herself, until it becomes clear that her life and Monique's life intersect in a surprising way. This is another one of those books that I'd heard a lot of, and quite honestly had never intended to pick up, but it was recommended to me by the same friend that recommended The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and apparently I need to listen to that friend more because I really enjoyed this. Thanks, Sam. I really liked this book. Everything just fitted together so well, and we're given just enough pieces to keep things interesting and to keep things moving, and it really pays off at the end with the big twist, and I just couldn't put it down. It just kept me wanting to keep reading, and I just needed more and more. And the characters, chef's kiss. I love complex, morally gray characters, and that's exactly what Evelyn is. She's ruthless, she's ambitious, she thinks practically before anything else. She does care deeply about the people around her, and she will go to extreme lengths to keep her and her little family, or her little chosen family, safe. Especially in this competitive world that she's in, especially for women. Side note, did anyone else picture Harry as Carson Kressley? Just me? I do have one major problem with this book, but it's kind of a spoiler, so maybe I'll make a whole separate video on it, because I do really want to talk about it, but I'm also not going to spoil it for anyone, so I don't know. Let me know down below if you'd be interested in that, because I'd love to do it, but I don't want to do it if nobody's gonna watch it, you know? Anyway, loved it. 4.5 out of 5 stars because of that one big problem, which I guess isn't that big of a problem if I'm only taking half a star off for it, but eh. The last book that I read in February was Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett was a very well-known fantasy writer. He's mostly known for creating the Discworld series, which is where the vast majority of his books take place. including this one. There are a few mini-series within the 30-odd Discworld books. Hogfather is part of the Death mini-series, meaning that one of the more prominent figures in it is Death. It kind of follows him and the people he surrounds himself with. And side note, Death, this character of Death on the Discworld, is one of my all-time favorite literary characters. Just saying. So, on the Discworld, there is a holiday called Hogswatch Night. It is basically the in-universe equivalent of Christmas, or Christmas Eve, I guess. Children are visited by the Hogfather and receive presents if they've been good. Except this year, the Hogfather has gone missing, and it's none other than Death himself who is currently replacing him. And Susan, Death's granddaughter, it's a long story, finds out about her grandfather's antics and sets out to find out why he's doing this. Full 5 out of 5 stars, like every Pratchett book. It's thoroughly entertaining. It's very funny, very witty. His books are always so comforting. They're always just so nice to read, and they make me audibly laugh. I think every Terry Pratchett book I've ever read is on my comfort read lists. The focus on this book specifically is on belief and why belief is so important to human nature. And not like spiritual belief, it's just like belief in anything really. And also on the evolution of mythology, which sounds very dry and boring when I put it like that, but it's actually thoroughly entertaining and very interesting when you stop to think about it. Like with most Terry Pratchett books, it's very light and very silly, and then suddenly hits you in the face with very deep philosophical ponderings. So you're just having a great time, vibing, and then you're like, Please pick up a Terry Pratchett book if you haven't yet. I personally recommend starting with Mort, which is the first one in the Death miniseries, because it's my personal favorite and I'm heavily biased. But there's also guides you can look up online for which ones are best to start with, and you can find one that's most to your liking. So, yeah. Please do yourself a favor and pick it up. If you want. If you want. And that is all for today. Thank you for listening, as always. And let me know what you thought of these books down in the comments. Did you like them? Did you not like them? You can also find me on Instagram at Leia Like the Princess for cosplay, acting, and cat content. And if you're interested in supporting my small business, you can find that on Instagram as well at Moonlit Cat Creations, or you can go to moonlitcatcreations.com. Toodles!